Good morning, evening, or afternoon, or whenever you might be watching this. Welcome back to U.S. History 1877 to the present. We ended off with World War I last class, and we are going to be picking up with the Roaring Twenties. My name is Professor Ferrero, and again, welcome to U.S. History 1877 to the present. So today we are going to be covering the Roaring Twenties. Is really going to be a response in the aftermath of both the Progressive Era and, of course, World War I. And with all of that being said, the Roaring Twenties is very much going to be a return to normalcy after the craziness of a world war, after the craziness of the Progressive Era. Everybody is just ready for things to go back to the way they once were. And that's where we're going to pick up today with the Roaring Twenties. So, in order to understand the Roaring Twenties, you first have to understand the president who's going to usher in the Roaring Twenties, Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding in the election of 1920, basically nobody expects him to win. It's actually a very interesting election. Teddy Roosevelt was the favored Republican nominee. However, he's going to die in 1919. Ultimately, Harding himself is a dark horse candidate. Nobody expects him to win. He comes out of nowhere in the final round of Republican voting, and he wins it. He's going to go ahead and he's going to run against the Democrat, and he's going to go ahead and he's going to win. Harding's whole campaign is return to normalcy. Things have been crazy these last 20 years, and let's let everything just go back to normal after the craziness of the Progressive Era and all the changes that it brought. And after all the craziness of World War I, let's just let things go back to normal. Ultimately, Harding, while he doesn't manage to get a lot done in terms of feminist or in terms of civil rights advocacy, he does have a soft spot for women and for minorities. He has a soft spot for women in more ways than one. He is quite the womanizer. However, he does, at the end of his life, reconcile with his wife. He turns away and repents of the cheating that he had done. Ultimately, his administration is going to be very, very scandalous. There's a lot of major scandals, not necessarily things he's doing, but things that are happening in his administration. Ultimately, just like World War II, World War I, there's a post-war boom in the economy, and they're going to ride that wave. Ultimately, though, Harding is one of our few presidents that's going to go ahead and die in office. He's going to die in 1923 due to a heart attack in San Francisco. So that is Warren G. Harding. He's going to be one of our two primary presidents during the Roaring Twenties. Personally, one of my favorite time periods in U.S. history. So let me get my face out of the way again. The 20s is going to be an era of prohibition and crime. With the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919, it is going to lead to the Prohibition era. Basically, what the 18th Amendment does is it makes it illegal to buy, manufacture, or sell alcohol. So if you had bought alcohol before the passage of the 18th Amendment, you could still legally drink it, but you can't make any more of it. So 18th Amendment, it has a lot of noble intentions, just like a lot of laws here in the United States and abroad. It had the best of intentions. Domestic abuse had been on the rise. Alcoholism had been on the rise, especially in the industrial world. And this is really their attempt to push out domestic abuse. It's really the feminists who are going to start pushing for prohibition. And it basically is just going to lead to everybody drinking illegally. People do it anyways. Similar to how drugs are associated with organized crime today, since alcohol is illegal at this time, it's going to be associated with organized crime as well. People are just going to sell it illegally. You have massive, massive groups such as the Mafia pop up in Chicago and New York. Rival gangs are going to fight each other for territory and for power. The biggest mafioso is going to be Al Capone. He's going to be based out of Chicago. He's the child of two Italian immigrants. Ultimately, Al Capone is running Chicago. He's running the mafia, and they can't catch him on anything. Because all of the cops, not all the cops, but most of the cops are dirty as well. And ultimately, nobody's willing to testify against him. Everybody knows he's out here murdering rival gangs. Everybody knows he's selling alcohol legally. But nobody's willing to testify against him. Ultimately, you see the birth of a lot of illegal distilleries. This is where you really see the rise of moonshine and moonshine runners. Moonshine runners are going to basically be people who are moving the moonshine from up in the mountains where it's being distilled down to the cities, areas like that. These are going to be people who actually soup up their cars and try to outrun the cops. That's why they're called moonshine runners. They would transport white lightning because it's supposed white lightning because, again, if you ever had moonshine, it hits you like a train. Very, very hard, very, very pungent, very, very high percentage alcohol. A big issue with this, though, is especially with hard liquors, if you mess up the manufacturing and production of hard liquors, it can lead to a lot of really bad consequences, including blindness. By the late 1920s, everybody's going to kind of realize that prohibition in and of itself is a failure. One nice thing of making things legal is you can tax them. And due to tax incentives and due to the failure of the 18th Amendment, they're going to repeal the 18th Amendment. It's going to be the only amendment in the U.S. Constitution to ever be repealed. It's going to be repealed by the 21st Amendment. An amendment needs another amendment to repeal it. You can't just erase it. The 21st Amendment basically says the 18th Amendment, yeah, just ignore that. So, to take a moment to talk about the most famous mafioso in American history, a little bit of a fun fact about him. He is not going to get caught for anything. Ultimately, the thing that they're going to manage to be able to arrest this guy on is tax evasion. They can't get him on the murder charges. They can't get him on the illegal liquor sale. What they do get him on is tax evasion. The IRS is able to put Al Capone in jail. So, continuing on, I posted a video down in the description as well on the 18th Amendment. I encourage you to watch it. It's by Ted Ed. I love Ted Ed's videos. They're really, really great. I encourage you to pause this video, watch it maybe in another tab, or wait until the end of this video and watch it. Of course, as always, I'll be posting some links to videos that I normally tie in when I teach this lecture in person. So, this is going to lead us to the Teapot Dome scandal. So the Teapot Dome scandal, again, we talked about Harding. Harding's administration has a lot of scandals, and the biggest and most critical one is going to be the Teapot Dome scandal. It's going to revolve around the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall. Albert Fall, basically he has control of all of these different U.S. U.S. government-owned lands all around the United States. And he is going to cut some backroom deals. It's all going to revolve around Teapot Dome, Wyoming. It's a very, very oil-rich piece of territory. And he's going to go ahead and he's going to cut deals with oil executives, with oil companies. Basically, he's taking a bribe. Very, very illegal. You cannot do that. Fall is eventually going to get caught for leasing out this land to private oil executives, private oil industries. He's going to go ahead and he's going to take the fall. Fall takes the fall, very fitting. Ultimately, what's Harding's response to all of this? Future president and cabinet member Herbert Hoover is going to approach Harding about all of this, and he's going to ask Harding, hey, what are you planning on doing about all of this stuff going on with Albert Fall, with this whole scandal going on? Harding's response is one that a lot of politicians tend to give, and is, I'm just going to ignore it until the problem goes away. And for the most part, that does kind of work for him. This is going to be the first time a U.S. cabinet member is going to be imprisoned due to crimes committed in office. This is the first time that this happens in American history. Understandably, this is going to cause the American people to lose a lot of trust in the U.S. federal government, and in particular, the president. So, with massive scandals, it tends to do these type of things. Same thing's going to happen with Watergate. The U.S. government loses a lot of credibility with the people. Same thing with Bill Clinton and the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Again, a lot of credibility tends to be lost when the president or the government is found out to be lying about a very, very major thing. So, Teapot Dome scandal. I encourage you to take a moment to pause and dissect this cartoon. That's always a skill that's important to learn, especially in U.S. history, breaking down political cartoons, breaking down documents. So go ahead, pause it, break it down. Tell me what you think it means. So, if you notice, this is the Capitol building over here on the side. The Capitol building is quite literally a teapot. This comes from the old saying, who says a watch pot never boils? I'm sure you've done this if you've ever been a college or high school student. You're up at like 2 a.m. in the morning, you're boiling water for your instant noodles, and it's not boiling. You're sitting there watching it, it's not boiling. You walk away for 5-10 minutes, you come back, the pot's boiling over. It's an old saying, watch pot never boils. This is a play on that saying, who says a watch pot never boils? The government is being watched, right? The government, we should have some level of transparency with it. People in the government knew what was going on with the Teapot Dome scandal. That's what this cartoon is saying. And if you look, all of the politicians, they're running out of the Capitol building as the teapot boils over, and it's catching quite a few of them in it. It's showing that a lot of people are caught up in this, and a lot of people knew about this and didn't do anything about it. So that's the Teapot Dome scandal. To go on a little bit further as well, in the 1920s. The 1920s is going to be an era of consumerism. We talked a bit about consumerism in the progressive era, but consumerism is going to continue to rise in the 1920s. Markets are going to start to advertise to the average person, and you're going to see the birth of a lot of department stores. Department stores such as Sears or Macy's or JCPenney's. For some of my younger viewers, you may not have really gotten to experience those that much because they've kind of been dying out due to companies like Amazon and Walmart. But these big department stores is where people used to go ahead and buy furniture, clothing, appliances, those type of things. You start seeing mass production of consumer goods, and that's going to lead to prices falling, because if you have more of a product, it is going to cost less. Increased supply is going to decrease the cost. Americans are also now going to have more money to spend on leisure and vacations. Movies, sporting events, those are going to really take off during the 1920s as well. While America on the whole is prospering, that doesn't mean that there aren't wealth disparities. By 1929, before the Great Depression hits, 40% of Americans still live in poverty. Ultimately, though, the economic policy of the Roaring 20s is really going to be a laissez-faire attitude. Laissez-faire means very, very hands-off on the economy. The government is hands-off. We don't mess with it. We're going to let the economy run itself. It is like capitalism dialed up to 100. No, laissez-faire is not going to advocate for regulation or anything like that. Laissez-faire is, again, hands-off in the economy. Communism, socialism, hands-on. Capitalism, laissez-faire, hands-off. Going to be characterized by low taxes, high tariffs, which is going to encourage American manufacturing, anti-unions, etc. All of these things are pretty characteristic of a very pro-business economy, at least pro-domestic business. You also do have other changes in culture as well. You have the birth of the flappers. You can't really talk about the 1920s without talking about the flappers. Many women are going to become flappers, although this is really only going to be a thing for unmarried women. It's going to be women really exercising their freedoms in ways that they hadn't before. Many, many cultural movements in the United States are going to push against the grain. The Beats come to mind. The hippies of the or during the Vietnam War is going to be another example. The flappers are really going to be the feminists' way of pushing against societal norms. If you look at the dress of the 1910s and early 1900s, it's going to be very, very conservative. Flappers are going to push against that. These are the liberated women. If you notice, too, a lot of skin is being showed compared to what you would expect before this. They wore more revealing clothing. They cut their hair short, which is not traditionally viewed as being feminine. And there's an idealization of the boyish figure. What do I mean by that? If you look at most flappers, they have very, very kind of, their dresses make their build look very, very straight. They make them look very rectangular, very boxy. So this is going to be on the rise during this time. If you've ever gone to any 1920s themed party or anything like that, or looked at any pictures from the 1920s, I guarantee you've seen flappers. These are like the most iconically dressed individuals of the 1920s. When you think 1920s dress, I'm sure you think flappers. So those are the flappers. They're the liberated modern women. Again, they're pushing against the societal standards of their time. This is going to bring us to the president who succeeds Warren G. Harding, and that is going to be Calvin Coolidge. He had been Harding's VP. Calvin Coolidge is personally my favorite president. this is biased, Professor Ferrero coming out. He is my favorite president. I think he's probably one of the best ones we've ever had. Coolidge was viewed as being very, very honest and very upstanding. He's going to do a lot to repair the damage that the Harding administration had caused to the federal government. Ultimately, in terms of how he's going to handle the economy, he is like the laissez-faire king. Hands off, let the economy run itself. It is not my job to go ahead and run these things. Coolidge is living the college dream. He is sleeping 10 hours a day. He sleeps 8 hours a night and takes 2-hour naps in the middle of the day. He's the last president we've had, at least as of 2025, to pay back the national debt. It has been almost 100 years since we have paid down our debt. Every president since him, year on year, has raised our national debt. Ultimately, Coolidge, while he is very, very hands-off with the government, he does end up actually being pretty favorable towards civil rights causes, especially Native American civil rights causes. He's going to invite Native American chiefs to go ahead and come to the White House. He's even going to put on a Native American headdress. We'll look at a picture of that on the next slide. And ultimately, his nickname, he was known as Silent Cal. One of my favorite stories is he was at a dinner party, and two reporters are talking to each other. One reporter says to the other one, "Hey, I bet you I can get Cal to say more than 3 words." Calvin Coolidge overheard him, and he said, "You lose." He literally says 2 words. He doesn't say anything else the rest of the night. Ultimately, oftentimes when he was in cabinet meetings, he really just responded with yes or no answers. He was just a chill guy. So I like Calvin Coolidge. Pretty cool president. Chill guy, you know? I'd say you could get a beer with him, but it was Prohibition. So you couldn't get a beer with Calvin Coolidge. And here he is at the White House. He was officially adopted into the Lakota Nation in 1927. So he is very favorable towards minorities and towards minority civil rights. However, since he's so hands-off, and this is unfortunately way before the civil rights movement, not a lot gets done under his administration. So, religious fundamentalism. Again, this is a return to normalcy. It's a return to the status quo. Yes, you have some people pushing against these ideas like the feminists, but you are going to see a fundamentalist revolt. Fundamentalism comes in many shapes and sizes. There are fundamentalists of every single religion. These are going to be the people that tend to be the most dogmatic and often tend to be the most extreme. For the 1920s, we are talking about fundamentalist Christians. Many Protestants are going to feel threatened by the decline of traditional values, especially over in Europe during this time. Europe's really turning away from Christianity throughout the 1900s, and that really starts pretty early on here in the 1900s. They're going to hold a very, very literal understanding of the Bible in terms of pretty much everything. They take a very literal stance on the Bible. Many revivalists are going to pop up, such as Billy Sunday, and the press is going to depict them as bigots and as being backwards. Fundamentalists tend to support Prohibition, and ultimately they have very similar views to the Puritans, which we will be talking about when we do U.S. history up until 1877 next semester. Puritans held the view of freedom as being your freedom is you submitting to God, you submitting to what is morally good, what is lawful. Freedom is found in submitting yourself to God and to morality. And they were very pro-legislating morality, which leads us to a question: to what degree ought we legislate morality, right? We're obviously going to legislate morality on some level. We're going to go ahead and tell people not to murder other people. That's legislation of morality. But at what point do we cut that off? If somebody is going to go ahead and vandalize my car, that is legislating morality. We are telling you, you are not allowed to do this thing because we say it's societally bad. But at the same time, we have drugs that are illegal, but we also have other drugs that aren't. Cigarettes and alcohol are 100% and totally legal here in the United States. Where do we draw the line? That's a question that ultimately you have to answer yourself. I can't answer that for you, nor do I think it's my job to answer that for you. But in part of being an American, in part of being a liberal democratic republic, a constitutional democratic republic, we need to decide what we think the moral issues are and what they aren't. It's really the whole discussion and debate behind politics, especially today. Both people on the left and the right are wanting to legislate morality at some level or another. It's just a question of what moral issues are we going to legislate? So I'll go ahead, get off my soapbox, but I do think that that's always important to talk about when talking about this lecture in particular. So, oops, give me 1 second. So, that is going to be the fundamentalist movement. So, with the fundamentalist movement, there's also going to be the Scopes monkey trial. I'm going to include a video once again in the description about the debate. It's a pretty good recap of how the debate goes. Ultimately, the Scopes monkey trial revolves around a court case in Tennessee. At the time in Tennessee in the 1920s, it is illegal to teach the theory of evolution in schools. Kind of crazy to think about. Today, it's the exact opposite. Evolution is what's taught in schools. John Scopes is going to go ahead and he's going to do it anyway. He's a young science teacher. I believe he's in his early to mid 20s. He wanted to challenge the law. At the time in Tennessee, creation as it's depicted in the Bible is what is taught. Scopes is going to be aided by the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. Basically, he's protesting the law. He thinks that it's bogus. The prosecution is going to be headed up by a William Jennings Bryan. You might remember him from our Gilded Age lecture and our lecture on the populist movement. Bryan is going to fight on the side of religious fundamentalists. It's going to happen in Dayton, Tennessee in July of 1925. I don't know if you are watching this from the southern part of the United States, but if you know anything about July in the southern part of the United States, you know it is extremely hot, and they do not have aircon at this point. The debate is going to be over creation versus evolution. Ultimately, Scopes loses the trial. He did violate the law. He has to pay a $100 fine. But in terms of the actual argumentation of evolution versus creation, Bryan gets whooped. Bryan is a politician. Bryan's not a biologist. Bryan is not a philosopher. Bryan is not a theologian. William Jennings Bryan is not really qualified to debate this topic, but he does, and he gets whooped. The argument of creation that Bryan puts forward is terrible. He gets beaten by the people who are arguing for evolution. So while Scopes does lose this trial, and he knows he's going to do it, really what he's trying to do is push against it, and the law within 10 years is revoked. They go ahead and they start allow evolution being taught in schools. Ultimately, because it's so late and it's so hot, if you watch the footage that I go ahead and post in the description, you're going to see everybody's fanning themselves. Bryan is going to die several days later in his sleep. I think he's in his 70s at this point. He's pretty old. The heat during the debate definitely didn't help. So, with that as well, you can't really talk about the 1920s without talking about the Harlem Renaissance. We talked about it a couple of lectures ago with the Exodusters. The late 1800s to early 1900s is really going to be characterized by African American migration from the South to the Northwest and major cities. You're going to see them move north to major enclaves in Chicago, in New York, in Pittsburgh, and the biggest concentration of African Americans, not even just African Americans, but black people in the world, is going to be in the neighborhood of Harlem in New York City. Harlem is going to become the capital of African American culture. You have all of these African Americans living in basically a 3-mile radius of each other, and you're going to see an explosion of the arts, of literature, of music, and of poetry. These people are really trying to create and understand what it means to be African American in the United States. You see the birth of jazz. Jazz is I guarantee you like some type of music that can trace its heritage back to jazz. You like rock and roll traces back to the blues traces back to jazz. Right? You like pop traces back to rock and roll. You can go all the way back there again. You like bluegrass goes back to blues goes back to jazz. almost every type of genre of music you like today can really trace its heritage back towards jazz. Unless if you're like, I am a classical music aficionado, it can probably trace its roots one way or another, if it's American music, back to jazz. Ultimately, they're going to coin the term, not going to say it, says it on the slide, don't want to necessarily offend anybody, but that term is created in order to symbolize the rejection of what was kind of the stereotypes of African Americans before, and really to symbolize the new identity that they are going ahead and finding. And again, I'd really encourage you to go ahead and look up some of the artwork, look up some of the literature. One of the biggest poets in American history is going to come out of the Harlem Renaissance. That's going to be Langston Hughes. He's really going to wrestle with the idea of what it means to be African American. So, here you can see some artwork from the Harlem Renaissance. You can see there's a lot of motion. There's unconventional colors. There's a lot of really soul behind it. And this is, again, the Harlem Renaissance isn't just one type of medium. It's poetry, it's art, like visual arts and sculpture and music and play. All of these things are being produced in Harlem. You're really seeing the creation of an African American culture. Here is what you would see as well. This is a family arriving in Chicago, a part of the Great Migration from the rural South. They did also move to American cities in the South as well. The two biggest, probably most well-known ones are going to be Houston and Atlanta. Houston and Atlanta, if you know anything about those two cities today, they still have a very large African-American population. I live in the Houston area. There are historically black Houston neighborhoods such as 3rd Ward and 5th Ward. So again, Great Migration, it's not just like they're all only going up north. As we know with the Exodusters, they also move out south. You also do see a continued crackdown on immigrants. The immigrants that I like to kind of jokingly call the off-whites are going to receive a lot of persecution. You have immigration quotas put in place. It basically says X amount of people get to come from this specific country. And if you notice, it tends to skew in favor of certain groups. So this is a chart taken from Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty. That's the textbook that we use in my classes. I want to take a moment to break down some of these numbers. So in terms of Africa, the whole continent of Africa is getting 1,100 people allowed in a year. Really not that many. Most Africans probably don't want to move to the United States, so you can't really feel too bad for them. Asia says 0. It's not technically correct. You do still have some Filipinos getting moved into the United States, but they're in American territory, so they kind of get a little bit of a pass. But realistically, no Asians are being allowed in the United States. The Chinese Exclusion Act is still in place, and after the Chinese Exclusion Act, you're going to see some crackdown on Japanese as well. Germany and Great Britain, those are massive, massive numbers. You are in the 6 figures there. Ireland as well. These are all Western European countries that share a very similar culture to the United States. They are allowed a lot more in. Even your northern European countries like Norway. Norway gets 6,000 people. Sweden gets 9,000, almost 10,000 people allowed in a year. You go to Southern Europe, you don't see it as much. Southern Europe, 3,000 or about 4,000 for Italy. It's not a whole lot. Poland, which is in Eastern Europe, you get about 6,000 people, and as you move further south and further east, it's fewer and fewer people. You definitely see that the preference of the United States is people from Western Europe with these immigration quotas. They don't like the off-whites. They don't like the Southern and Eastern Europeans. And we'll end off with this little political cartoon here of it showing, again, immigration issues. And I think that's important to go ahead and end on, too, because it really shows that in American history and in history as a whole, the issues that we face today, they aren't new to us. They might be different from what's in the past, but ultimately, the problems that we face today are very similar to the problems that we faced in the past, and a lot of the times they're the exact same thing. And this is why it's so important to know history, why it's so important to know what happened in the past. I'll leave you off with that. I hope you have a wonderful day. Be sure, if you liked it or if you're in one of my courses, to go ahead and subscribe. Leave a comment if you have any questions. If you are actually in one of my classes, please write down any questions that you have about the lecture. We'll go ahead and we'll answer it in class. And, forever out. Have a lovely day.